Right now, I'm going to show you how to nature journal in the jungle. One of the main challenges is going to be deciding where to start. There is so much going on around here and so much complexity and so much information that you might be intimidated and you might just keep walking, keep taking photos and never actually pull out your nature journal. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm just going to start with a leaf, any single leaf, and I'm going to at least that way get something down on my paper and start the process of nature journaling. I'm also going to put down my metadata. I'm not starting with a blank page because I have some stuff from yesterday, but if you are starting with a blank page, starting by nature journaling and just drawing a leaf, writing some notes about it, maybe measuring it to include words, pictures, and numbers is the best way to get started. This also gives some time for the jungle around you to quiet down a little bit, for your disturbance to be reduced, and for more things to potentially come out. Okay, so how easy was that? At least I have a start now and I have something down on my page and I've started the momentum. Dealing with that inertia at the beginning is the hardest part. Once you start nature journaling, it's really easy to keep going, but getting started can be really challenging, especially when you're in an area like this. So I'm gonna, now that I have this sort of basic drawing here, I'm gonna add some word notes, some questions. So for example, what ate this part here? Assuming something ate it. Oh, I'm gonna measure this distance too. I just heard a large bird fly near me. This is what usually happens when you, oh, it just moved again. This is what usually happens when you start nature journaling with a plant or a tree or a landscape. Pretty soon, other things will start moving in. It just flew away. The bird just flew away. Okay, so when you're in a real jungle, you might want to be a little bit conservative with your watercolor usage. I would normally go right ahead and add watercolor to this leaf. However, the humidity here is so high that it's going to take a long time to dry, and not only will my palette be wet and challenging to close, but my page will also be wet and it'll be really easy to smudge things around. So I'm actually just going to leave this black and white for now, and whatever I would indicate with the watercolor, I can use words. So for example, there are these stains and these brown parts. I can just use words and say, and an arrow pointing to it and say brown spot. That whole issue of managing your watercolor in these high humid environments can be really challenging, and something that I'm gonna do a video about later. But you can see inside of my watercolor palette how shiny these colors all are. They look as if they've just been used, and that's because there's so much humidity that they are very wet, and a lot of them start to sort of move when they're that wet. You can see here all of these little bits of color from that side that have come out on this part of the palette. Those are very messy, and if you touch those and have those on your finger, they can get onto other parts of your page. And now you know that I profess a fault-tolerant nature journaling style, and while my nature journaling style is relatively fault-tolerant, having blotches of watercolor all over the place and concentrated amounts of pigment pigment splooging out all over the place in my palette is still problematic. So that is something you'll want to take into consideration. Now that we have this leaf, I'm just going to add some basic information about where I am in the trail system and the time. So it's 8:57 right now. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to guess the temperature. I'm going to guess it's about high 80s. And I'm going to guess that the humidity is about 95%. That's why I'm sweating so much right now, probably. 95% RH. So I got that going on. While I was standing here, I also noticed there's some taper tracks on the ground, which is super cool. That's the taper track right there. So I'm gonna do a quick sketch of the taper track while I am here. On this one, I'm gonna use water-soluble ink instead of watercolor. I'm also gonna use my water brush that puts out the least amount of water. My knees really hurts for this position. It's about 15 centimeters across all the way. Not the best drawing of an animal track that I've ever done, but it's good enough. I'm not going to add any more information with my water-soluble pen. Even this I probably should have done with a different pen, just because if I do get wet later on, especially because we are in a tropical rainforest, water can happen. All of the rest of this will bleed. It could still be legible, but it is, you know, something to keep in mind whenever you add water-soluble material to your page. Okay, so now that I got those two things on, I'm gonna keep moving. And I'm gonna move slowly now and pay attention. I'm basically gonna turn this nature journaling session into a curiosity wander. If you've seen my other video about how to do a curiosity wander, it's sort of the default nature journaling technique. So I'm gonna move slowly, and if something catches my attention, I will nature journal it. So now one of my main challenges is going to be balancing moving and covering ground versus just focusing. I mean, I could spend a whole week nature journaling in this small area right here, but sometimes getting in a little bit more movement, covering a little bit more ground, means it's possible to see some new stuff. I normally recommend walking with your nature journal out by your side and open, ready to go, but because of the high likelihood of large drops of water or mud or things like that getting on my pages, and I already have some pages that contain some material, I am going to, once it is completely dry, close it and put it back into my bag. That way I also have my hands free. Sometimes when you're walking on uneven ground in the jungle, it's good to have your hands free. Always wear rubber boots when going out on the trail. All right, so I found the next thing that interests me, and I could just walk right by. I could say, hey, this is not that big of a deal. It's just a bunch of cool adventitious roots growing from a palm tree. But instead, I'm not going to be lazy. I'm not going to keep walking. I'm going to pull out my nature journal and tackle this subject. All right, so here's what I got. I have a basic drawing of the roots, some observations and things I was curious about that I noticed that I wrote down, several diagrams where I zoom in on parts of the roots, and then I also have this diagram which is a form of quantification showing the height of the tree. And so right now I'm just going to make a guess on the height of this palm. I'm gonna say it's about 50 feet tall. While you're walking, stop every once in a while to look around. Make sure that you have binoculars. If you do have your journal out, or if perhaps you have a small journal with you, you can take quick notes about the things that you see. So for example, if you were doing a type of nature journaling where you have a small journal, you could just be taking little notes about the bird species that you see or things that you hear. You can also do that in your normal format journal. As you move through the jungle, and this applies to other ecosystems as well, remember to vary your vision. So go from the very close up micro inspection of small things and then zoom out and look at the bigger picture. So if you notice yourself just looking at the tracks on the ground and being really focused on the tracks or the plants on the ground, make sure that every once in a while you look up and scan the bigger environment. If you're always looking ahead at the bigger environment, make sure that every once in a while you look down, because you'll notice things that you wouldn't otherwise. Did I mention to always wear boots in the jungle? When you have a rare opening, a light gap, this is an ecologically significant thing, but also a good time to do a landscapito. Sometimes it's hard to do landscapitos when you're in the jungle because there's so much vegetation in the way. So it's really important to use a viewfinder or to crop what you're going to draw or paint and keep it really small. When dealing with just a whole bunch of thick, complicated greenery in the jungle, sometimes it's good just to simplify your shapes and let the watercolor do the work. So I'm getting close to the end of my hike for right now, so I'm going to use my watercolor. Remember I mentioned earlier that it can be a challenge to use watercolor in high humidity conditions. So let's take out the watercolor palette and see what it looks like in there and make a plan of action on how we're going to use watercolor successfully without getting bogged down by the humidity. So I unfortunately only have a pretty small towel with me, but that's going to be useful for cleaning my brush and also maybe for absorbing extra moisture or even cleaning up some of these places where my watercolors are spilling out. So I'm going to be really careful of this zone right here, not to get any of that on my fingers. Solid Winsor violet would be problematic, especially for whatever reason. It seems like that one is one of the ones that most starts to get out of its little place there. So having a palette that's not over full would be one thing that could help. It also does seem like certain colors are more likely to liquefy in high humidity environments. I'm definitely gonna not use my really new water brush, the one that puts out the most water. This took me a long time to learn, but having a new water brush, it puts out a lot more water, and an older one puts out a little bit less. So I always carry at least 2 in my kit and use them accordingly. I'm going to start with the one that's sort of in between. As usual, I'm going to start with the palest values, which in this case will be the sky and the ocean. So in this case, I want sort of a graded wash from the ocean, darkest closest to the shore and lightest furthest to the horizon, and then the opposite with the sky, darkest near the top and getting paler towards the horizon. I wish that were a little bit lighter near the horizon. I might try to lift that out. Since my sky color was a non-staining color, I was able to lift a little bit of it out and make it a little bit more pale near the horizon. Now I'm gonna come in and do some of this. Actually, I'll add a little teeny bit of color to the clouds. It's always dangerous to add gray to your clouds because gray can often be too dark. And you want the sky as a whole to be a paler value than pretty much anything else in your painting. All right, so now I'm gonna do the foreground. I usually start with Serpentine Genuine. I'm running out of that, but it should be fine. I'll get this part near the top. It's starting to spill out of its little area there, you can see. Serpentine Genuine is definitely melting in the tropics. Okay, so now I'm gonna come in here, and I don't have any really pale stuff, so I'm just gonna go ahead and do pretty much everything with this green. I'm gonna leave some sky holes, which I already put in place with the blue. Actually, they're ocean holes in this case because I'm sort of looking downhill. Remember, this is going to be your palest green. Most things in the foreground are probably going to be darker than this. If you're trying to make your painting faster, you could just do this darker in your first wash. Okay, now I'm going to take a shadow violet here and mix it with a little bit of blue. And with that color, I'm going to paint that island in the background, but I still want to be fairly light value, so I'm going to test the value over here. I kind of wish that I had a little bit of blue, more blue or purple in that island color, but it's fine, that'll work. Now I'm gonna use that same color for this foreground branches here. I don't want it to have local color, it's sort of backlit, so I'm gonna keep it that way and exaggerate that in my painting. That looks perfect for what I wanted. I'm gonna keep this foreground relatively simple. I'm not gonna get obsessed with the palm leaves, hopefully. I'm actually gonna come in with a little bit of quinacridone gold right now for some yellow little highlights, hopefully in things that are sort of close. Then I'm gonna go to the serpentine genuine again and do some of the closer palm leaves and closer vegetation here in the front. And whenever you don't want to draw the vegetation, what you can do is just try to separate it into blocks. Sometimes it naturally comes in blocks that you can easily see. Sometimes you have to sort of use your imagination a little bit to fill in where those blocks should be. So you can see here how I turned that foreground into basically a block, and behind it, it has less wash, so it's paler. That automatically creates that sense of depth. That is one of the most important things to get in a landscape painting. So that's more important than me getting the details on this palm leaf. So I might sort of neglect these palms a little bit. I'm gonna take some of this phthalo yellow green. It's my most saturated green here, and I'm gonna put a little bit of it here in the foreground to suggest a plant here in the foreground with very bright leaves. Having some saturated stuff up in the front helps make the foreground stand out. It's a little bit of a wet on wet, so there's not that much contrast. Ideally, there would be more contrast there and it would be a different value than the element behind it. That's okay. I'm gonna add sort of my last touches here, or let this dry just a tiny bit and then add my final touches. While that's drying, I can always switch to drawing or note-taking. I can note what some of these species are if I know them, or my location. I think I know the name of the island, but I'm not totally sure, so I'm not gonna write that down yet. This is almost dry enough for what I wanna do, but not quite. While it might be tempting, you should never put your stuff down in the tropics, or avoid it as much as possible. If you do have to unburden yourself of something, it's preferable to hang it as opposed to putting it on the ground. Just make sure that the tree that you're using to hang something on is not covered in biting ants, or does it not have any eyelash viper sitting on it. Now I can stretch.
1, 2, 3, 4. Work it, work it, work it. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Also make sure you drink a lot of water.
Oh dang, look, an ocelot fighting a harpy eagle. Oh man, oh man, oh man, oh man, oh man, oh man. Please still be there, please still be there, please still be there.
Ding darn dingling.
All right, my page is probably wet enough, so I'm gonna continue and finish with one last wash of watercolor on this landscapito. All right, I think I'm gonna leave it at that. I could push some darker darks in the fore or mid ground, but I'm not going to, even though they would help contrast with that pretty dark background. I think this is pretty good for what I'm shooting for, and that gives me a pretty good nature journaling session in the jungle.